Welcome to Tobi's Arts Performed podcast. On this platform, Tobi will engage with artists and performers about their passions and interests. My name is Anirrudha Das. I'm a producer of experimental and electronic music. So that work is divided into across a number of different projects, but it encompasses that whole idea of being electronic and also experimental.
Hello everyone, I'm your host Tobi and welcome to the 25th episode. This week I talked to Anirrudha Das AKA Dr. Das about his family education with the Indian Harmonium that has influenced his work in the Asian Dub Foundation and his solo projects, and the principle of dub in dub music and dub morphology. I'll be going to a concert at the Garage in London to see the Asian Dub Foundation, so come along to see them. You can find Anirrudha and the Asian Dub Foundation on the website links below.
So one of the things I do is I'm bass player, co-founder and a producer and composer with Asian Dub Foundation. But aside from that, I do my own work under different names, under the name of Dr. Das, under the name of Dangsha, Cerulean, various more electronically biased projects, electronic programming mixed with a lot of noise generated in different ways. I also, in that capacity, collaborate with a London audiovisual project called Dub Morphology.
That's with Gary Stewart.
Gary Stewart and Trevor Matheson.
So this is where I first met you.
Yeah.
At Goldsmiths College on the, was it the Saturday?
On the Saturday at the Strictly Vinyl conference, Outer National, which was it was broadly speaking in relation to sound system culture, which was predominantly in relation to dub and reggae culture in Britain. But we were invited to present like perhaps one of the consequences of the development of that culture. So one of the possible offshoots of the whole culture of reggae and dub, but perhaps going off in a more scientific direction.
Well, without kind of digressing too much, when I've looked into it myself, from the reggae sound system that was brought over originally in Britain, there's just so many offshoots like punk and kind of skinhead, even the early skinhead movement and stuff, and even kind of right up to acid house and then what you guys did in the 90s.
And you can add to that jungle, very much jungle
and grime today.
Grime, absolutely. There's almost like an unbroken lineage, or maybe not a single line, more like branches from that same trunk, but that can all trace their roots literally back to the same place.
I'd like to make an observation. You give off an air of kind of a burden of responsibility. I get off you that you're kind of weighted down by an urge to do something, an urge to... Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
The general gist makes sense, but I wouldn't use phrases like burden or weighted.
Well, this it's the only words that come to me.
Sure. I don't feel it to have any kind of burden. I do have an urge to express what is in my what's inside my head, which I also feel is also part of a collective expression. All right, so I give my personal take on something that's quite collective. So it isn't a me thing.
Yeah.
For definite.
Well, it's something I recognise in a lot of other people, and not just musicians.
Right.
Kind of people that have this urge to, I suppose, like a calling or a vocation. I'm not sure what to call it, really.
Right. I don't kind of often analyse it. I just...
Yeah, it's just...
I just get on with that. But there is definitely... I've never really been interested in the notion of a separate artist and a separate consumer of that art. For me, it's always been more that I am still in the world, the same world as the audience. I'm not separate from that. And part of what I do is to encourage, in what I'm doing, I hope some of the outcome will be that it encourages people to engage with the world in the same way. You know, to not see themselves separate from expression and art, and also to not see art and expression as something that is separate from the rest of your life. You know, and in various times in human history, those notions have been more integral to the degree people are unaware. You know, so you are working in the fields, or you're making stuff in order to survive, in order to provide for your family's well-being or the well-being of your community, but you're also engaged in art and music, and you didn't necessarily perceive yourself, those things, to be separate, disparate entities, you know. So you could be working in the field, and as you're waiting for the crops to literally flower and bloom and come to fruition, you know, you play music, you write music, or you engage in dance, you know, and or writing or poetry, whatever. And over time, those have become quite separate activities.
But I think that in different cultures, that's still, people still live like that.
Yes, absolutely. Even though we live in this culture here, in Britain, I'm very much part of what you just mentioned, in that music, and in particular, was already in our family as something that we did and had to learn. You know, my aunt sung, my father sung, and then my aunt taught myself and both my sisters to sing Bengali folk and contemporary music, how to play the harmonium, which was my earliest musical education, and actually that impacted on my whole approach to bass and to dub bass.
Oh, okay.
As 20 years later. So I was studying harmonium, singing, learning Indian scales. All right, to not perhaps an advanced level, but to a good enough level for it to impact upon my bass playing and percussion playing at 20 years later. You know, learning about my approach to bass was very much about cyclical melodies.
Is that what you call the rhythm scales? The rags?
Rugs, yeah. Rugs are more specifically to do with Indian classical music.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but it's informed a lot of other music in the same way as classical music might inform you as a pop musician or a rock musician or the music culture in general. In over here in India, classical education touched upon other areas of music. I wasn't classical trained or anything, but my father listened and had at one time aspirations to do that kind of training
Right.
musical training. He wasn't allowed to do that, but he always continued in his own time to do that and to listen to that music. And I would hear it, in fact, in this very room.
So this is where you were brought up?
I was brought up in this room. There's a lot of history in this room in relation to the music I've done, even to Asian dub, and a lot of electronic music was literally in this room. But I would sit and practice here as well as in other rooms in the house. On the harmonium, I would hear my father's classical music. So the harmonium is a 3-octave keyboard organ that you play with one hand, because one hand is playing the keyboard while the other hand operates the bellow at the back. And basically it's an example of Indian kind of technology, Indian modification of what was a European idea.
It was invented in India, wasn't it? Was it invented by Indians?
Well, it was an adaptation of the European organ, which had been brought to India by the Portuguese. But in European culture, the organ was an instrument that you played with, where you sat, on a chair or a stool to play. Yeah. And so, thereby being able to play with two hands and operating the air with your feet, all right, pump organ, all right. But in Indian culture, a lot of music is sedentary, all right. The musicians are sat on the floor, right. All right. So that meant at some point they had to think of a way of playing this instrument, what they found to be an interesting instrument that the people had brought from the West, and adapting it to Indian musical ideas and the Indian way of playing music. All right, so at least the Indian classical way, which is as sitting down on the floor, not on chairs. Yeah, and so at one point this adaptation took place. So Indian musical engineers will have said, "Oh, we can put that bellow round the back." But for me, it's interesting as well that they didn't see it as a limitation that you're only playing the keyboard with one hand. And that's very much to do with the fact that Indian classical music is not about harmony. It's about rhythm and melody. It's about melody, and a lot of that melody is cyclical patterns. Okay, and it's not about chords. All right, so that's what was meant by harmony. Right. It's not about chords and key changes and all of that. And you might have accidental harmonies, when different instruments are interacting, you get these overtones and stuff. But that's not what's central to the music. So the whole concept of harmony and chords and different colours in the music, that comes from the West.
When I first heard Asian Dub Foundation, I didn't get into it because I had kind of tunnel vision. I used to listen to rock and heavy metal. Right. I didn't get into it then, but when I've come back to it, it's like been speaking to you and that, listening to the different music and the different tunes. I think it was Rafi I was listening to, right? And I watched one of the Lahane concert in Turkey, I think. And what I got from it is that on the one hand, in the Asian Dub Foundation, the music is very much taps into what was around at that time, kind of an ambient, common ambient thread through a lot of different music. But I think what you've just said there about the Indian music and the rhythms, and what I noticed when I was listening to it last night, that there was, along with that ambient thread and that ambient feel, there's another layer to it.
Yeah, there is definitely influence, and see what people think. A way a lot of people think is is to kind of reflect or express where you're from culturally, that you literally have to play. Oh, let's take a sitar or let's take a tabla, and that's a very literal a way of incorporating your culture. Other ways are, can we make use of certain principles? Okay, and if you make use of a principle, you can then utilize that principle on an instrument that is not necessarily associated or stereotypically associated with where you're from. So here's the connection again between the harmonium and the bass. So on the harmonium, I'm learning how to play Indian scales. I'm learning how to play this thing called the principle of palta. Palta means to mix things up. All right.
Is that an Indian thing?
It's a word in both in Bengali and probably in Hindi as well. Palta means to change things around.
Is that P or a B?
P. P for Peter. Palta. So the nearest equivalent to doing paltas in Western music is arpeggios. So it's where you go a few notes up the scale and you go a couple of notes back, and then from there you go the same. So da 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 da, and that's palta. Okay, right. So Western ears might recognize that as arpeggio, but we call it palta. And I would play those. That's one of the things that I was learning on the harmonium. And then you're creating, basically you've got your 12 notes, and it's the same 12 notes. There's no different 12 note in India from the West. It's the same 12 tones, it's 12 semitones, and in each scale or rag there might be you're making use of whatever 6 or 7 of those notes. And then it's like, the idea of palta is, well, how do you make loads of variations and hundreds of songs out of the same few notes? You play them in different orders, or you create sequences, which is the basis of modern electronic music. Sequencing.
12-bar blues.
It's a sequence. It's a sequence. 1, 4, 5, but you do it in different orders. You do inversions. You swap it around, and that principle, I had some formal training on the bass, but not a lot, and I wasn't interested. I didn't want to play 12-bar blues or rock progressions. I didn't want to play the role of a Western bass player, which is to be the worker, and while other people are expressing. Right. So all those melodies that I learnt on the harmonium, I just played them straight learnt to play them on the bass, and that formed a very melodic and very cyclical foundation. And of course then I realised there's this accidental musical link between Indian rags and dub, in that dub bass lines are cyclical and they're melodic. You can sing them. They're hook lines basically, and as such, it's pop. But it's an inversion of Western pop, whereby the hook lines, the catchy melodies, are played on upper register instruments, be it the vocal or a guitar or keyboard. That's where you get the nice melody that people want to sing to. All right. In reggae culture and sound system culture, it's inverted. Those nice melodies, those catchy lines, are the bass lines. Okay. And also it's to do with different technologies. There it relates to sound system culture. Sound system culture is all tuned to the bass. All right. The bass being the omnipresent, overriding foundation of the whole thing. Okay, and it's almost like the status of the instruments is inverted as well. All right, so the bass line is all important, and all the other instruments are actually supporting the bass, and it's a complete inversion of the hierarchy that we see in Western pop, which is bass and drums are supporting guitar, bass, and vocals.
Yeah.
All right, so what I did was, as soon as I got into the bass, it was obvious to me that I should be playing, just trying to play the melodies that I learned as a child, that came from supposedly a completely different culture.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and it made sense. So that is another underlying factor in the music of Asian Dub Foundation. It wasn't simply the literal sampling of tablas and Indian sounds, which we did do, you know, making that direct, more literal cultural reference, but it was also in the way we approached guitar and bass and rhythm in general. It's very cyclical. And again, sequencing technology, drum machines, sequencers, they all bear this relation to cyclical music, because they are by their nature cyclical.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so there's this inbuilt futurism in traditional music.
Yeah, yeah. That's
You know,
amazing.
so we were just basically realizing those principles, and therefore we were bringing a kind of more scientific approach to it, and thereby overriding all of those cultural stereotypes, you know.
Yeah.
And pulling out what was essentially the scientific nature of Indian music, if not Indian, various Indian cultures as well. You know, the actual science in there, the whole, the notion of recycling. Again, sampling. What is sampling? It's recycling.
Yeah, yeah.
It's recycling, and I also call it recycling of sonic waste, meaning there's a lot of sounds that could be discarded that on their own people would say, oh, it has no value. But if you recognize the potential of a little sound, you take it, you edit it nicely, and you then loop it and sequence it, it becomes, it unfolds out into this landscape of sound that you juxtapose with other sounds that have come from supposedly disparate sources, and you create something new. But it's all been created from sonic waste, you know. Sometimes it, you know, okay, yeah, there's a very beautiful bass line or a very beautiful tabla there. But me personally, I used to look at noise and sounds and bits of echo trailing off at the end of a record, and I thought, oh, I'll have that.
Yeah.
That sounds beautiful, but I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna sequence it. So I'm gonna make this noise into a melody.
Well, I think the greatest innovations in music are from using that, as you call it, sonic waste. I mean, Genesis P-Origin and Throbbing Gristle, they invented industrial music.
Yeah.
And everything they did was was sonic waste.
Yeah.
And acid house music from that, and all that.
Played a couple of gigs back in the day with Genesis P-Origin.
Really?
Yeah. One of my.
What was it like to meet? Was it
what? I have no recollection of even talking with him.
Oh, okay.
It was a long time ago. It's back in the 80s, and
that early. So
I'm not young. I'm 55.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So back in the mid 80s, you know, I was my mid 20s. I was.
So that must have been around the same time as they were doing the.
That's right.
The acid house.
That's right. It was the mid to 80s, heading towards the 90s.
Yeah.
And I recall doing at least 2 gigs with them. I don't remember much about the gigs. All I remember, we did one in Manchester. That my only overriding recollection was that at the end of their set, by the end of their set, there was loads of people on stage who had no clothes on. That's my only recollection of that. But the gig we did with them in London was actually in Dingwalls, and the project we had was called DFD, and that was myself and a producer who's now a producer called Ramjack, and I did a lot of work with him. And this
was before Asian Dub Foundation?
Yeah. But I had to learn my electronic skills somewhere.
Oh, okay.
You know,
I didn't know you had a kind of musical career before that.
I wouldn't call it a career. I would say musical experience.
Right.
You know, but from basically going back, I was making sounds, experimenting with sounds, and bouncing recorded sounds between cassette players and reel to reel, going back to 1982 when I was studying in college. All right, and that's the time I first met Gary, because he was also studying and he lived across the road from me, and I became friends with him, having seen him around, and he had a collection of dub 12 inches or reggae 12 inches, and I'd flip them over and hear the dub versions on the other side, and that's how I learnt about dub music.
Right.
But we had this common interest in just messing around with sounds and instruments and whatever, again, sort of found objects, you know, kind of physical waste, and making music from it, you know, pieces of metal, old electric heaters that you could bang and made their interesting clangs, and then you put them through an echo machine and make mad sound, and then you record it and whatever. So I was making experimental sounds, and even my first little band with Gary back then, while I was an art student and he was an engineering student.
Yeah.
All right. And then that was in Nottingham, and then returning to London like about 1986, I started to work with a friend that I'd met 5 years before, who's now known as Ramjack, who's a producer and musician, and it was with him we did a project called DFD, where we were using percussion, early sampling and sequencing, heavy percussion arrangements, and it was with that project that somehow, through all the acid house links, because we used to go and get gigs at early acid house parties.
Yeah.
All right. When it was still DJs, and we would go and play in the chill out room, you know, on account of both of us being percussionists. And then we started to take in our pieces of kit and drum machines and stuff, and that's the time where musicians, producers started to go out and play live on the acid house scene. So it expanded from being a DJ only thing.
Yeah.
All right. So the first port of call was the chill out rooms, and then eventually the people's promoters saying, "Oh, you should be the main act now," you know. And so you had people like Orbital developing at that time, Mix Master Morris, all kinds of acts like that. And so somehow at some point, I have no recollection how it happened, we got to play a couple of gigs of Genesis Peorage. I don't know if they were still calling it Throbbing Gristle. I think it was Genesis Peorage at that moment.
Somewhere around 1985, I think they left Throbbing Gristle and started doing acid house.
Right. That's right. That's right.
85, 86, something like that.
That was exactly that time, and we were there. And I remember that they had something that was pretty much acid house, a vinyl, whether it was an album or a 12-inch come out.
I think it's called Jack the Tab.
Yeah, something like that. So I remember that point. And so we had a gig at Dingwalls, and it was great. It's one of the best gigs I've done, and we still remember to this day because there was a particular incident that happened. So there was 3 of us as percussionists on stage with sequences running from our samplers and drum machines behind us. And as we were playing, at one point, one of us will have knocked out the power lead from the sampler. So all the electronic beats went off, and it just left us with the percussion. But at that point, we just carried on playing because the audience were dancing and getting it. We just carried on playing. And then Mixmaster Morris, who is a well-known person on... Yeah. He's supposed to have invented ambient music.
Oh, okay.
Accidentally, because his drum sounds weren't going out front and only on stage, so the audience... He didn't realise, and the audience kept on dancing. So, you know, and they were only getting all the ethereal sounds.
Yeah.
All right. But anyway, he clocked what had happened. He plugged the sampler back in, loaded it up, and at a certain point, hit play again, and it come back in. And we had kept rock solid in our timing because we were solid musicians. And that was just such an amazing audience, and the whole thing lifted. We just all looked at each other and thought, what the fuck? Yeah. And then we looked around, we realised what had happened. He'd just loaded it all up again. Yeah. And the audience, they were none the wiser. They thought that was all part of the plan.
Part of the set.
It's all, you know. Yeah. And it was quite an amazing moment in an amazing gig, in an amazing time. A time of, you know, innovation, experimentation, and a great moment when experimentation coincides and collides with being popular at the same time. And for me, dub music is such a moment, because what is dub? It's actually something quite abstract and experimental. You strip the music right down. Yeah. It's abstract. Okay, you're fragmenting the song. You know, it's music concrete. And acid house was the same. Yeah. You know, you got people going mental to barely much more than a kick, a hi-hat, and this squiggly noise. Yeah. It's so minimal. Yeah. And there's thousands of people. Of course, they had some help, you know, in terms of certain drugs, but still, it's this really abstract sound.
But I think this is the thing. I think it's tapping into something that's not something you can't verbalize.
Yeah.
But there's kind of some kind of vein that people tap into. And
do you mind if I take pictures?
No, go for it, please. And in fact, I'd like to take a selfie with us so I can put it on the blog. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's bands like yourself and Genesis Peerage and other bands as well. Yeah. You tap into something that you can't effectively describe. Yeah. I mean, it's art, isn't it? Really.
Yeah. It's art.
In describing it, you're corrupting what it is, but in experiencing it, that's what it is, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the phrase, what has often come up is collective unconscious. And
right.
But I like to use the phrase, invert that and go the collective conscious. You know, there's certain things going on. I think in one way art is a vocalization a manifestation of things that people are thinking and are living.
Can I just backtrack a second?
Yeah.
You spoke about Indian music as being very scientific.
Yeah.
Now, there's something I find it really interesting, because I get what you're saying, and I completely understand it. But intellectually, when you look at it, there seems to be like somewhat of a paradox between the intellectual, the scientific, the analytical aspect of that music.
Yeah.
But then engaging with it in a visceral way.
Yeah.
Creating it. And that's the...
Oh, yeah. That's
it shouldn't work, but it does. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't make sense.
Oh.
Well, this is art, isn't it?
Yeah. I think the point is to not separate the scientific off from visceral, from the emotional. They're all... I was maybe emphasizing one aspect, and it's science in terms of the form.
Yeah.
All right. The same with Indian languages.
No, but I think it is very important to look at those things.
Of course.
Particularly, I mean, you go through the history of India, and I can't remember who said it, but they said that the Indian science and philosophy are brothers of the Hellenic sciences.
Right.
That they ran parallel, even though they didn't develop together. They run parallel, and
some run parallel, some predated.
Yeah.
Which they don't want to say.
Oh, okay, right.
They don't want to admit that. There's a lot of aspects of mathematics that came from India. The Romans still had Roman numerals, right? Arabics were using the zero and making...
Is that a new thing that you're...
Had thereby created a system of counting and measuring that was far more efficient and far superior than having to use V's and X's and 1's.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, some is a parallel, some predates, and went from, took different physical routes to get to what is today Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about your photography?
Yeah.
Because I've seen some of the pictures on your Instagram.
Right. Nottingham Community Arts Centre.
What's community darkroom?
A community darkroom. That means it was a community arts centre, which had a darkroom facility, which people would come to use, but also did some kind of teaching of basic photography, black and white printing, because it was back in the day of film and black and white and composition. So, and then I did that also for a couple of years when I returned to London, so between 86 and 88. But what was happening at that moment was I was getting more and more involved in music, and that was taking over, and I had the passion for music, and my passion for photography was waning at that moment.
Right.
And so what happened, and when I, like around 1990, I got accepted onto a community music course. So community music was a music teaching organisation, and it still exists today. Once that was happening, I kind of felt really at home. I kind of knew what I wanted to do. That was based in a number of places in North London. I think originally when I joined in Kentish Town, and then later, because this is where Asian dub originated, through workshops I was doing. I got involved in music, teaching, and as well as performing, and photography kind of disappeared out of my life, really. Not to return until the advent of digital cameras in the 90s. Really.
Oh, okay.
Not even 90s. I'm talking early 2000s.
Right.
You know, digital cameras started coming out properly around that time. ADF, we got to play in Japan round about the year 2000, or earlier actually, 98. And so you're seeing, I'm seeing all these cameras come out in Japan, which looked amazing, you know. Yeah. Seeing digital cameras for the first time, and so, I saw someone with one in particular looked fantastic. It was more lens barrel than body. And I just thought, what is that? And on a trip to Japan, I bought my first digital camera there. So that got me back into photography. But the current stuff that you see, that has a specific route as well. Going back about 5 years ago, there was an exhibition at the Tate Modern, by a joint exhibition which featured Japanese photographer called Daido Moriyama, and he's pretty well known photographer, and his approach to photography just completely blew my mind, and it also took me back to what I was doing in 1986. And it's almost his approach is almost anti-photography. All right.
Okay.
All right. It's, you could describe it as punky. The Japanese call it arebure bokeh, which means rough, blurred, out of focus. You know, skew with compositions.
Right.
Really, really high contrast. Really grainy images. All right. And that style kind of emerged in Japan at the end of the 60s, where you had an environment in Japan that was way more political than it is today. You had lots of riots, anti-war demonstrations. Yeah, you wouldn't
Japan?
Yes, you wouldn't realise.
That's
from
amazing.
Now. Yes,
I know people that have visited Japan, and there's one guy that took a load of photographs. He's a French guy.
Yeah,
he was showing me these photographs that he took, and some people had, like, young people had coloured hair, and he said that's as far as they go in terms of rebellion.
Yeah, well, we're talking about a few generations removed. We're going back to a time where, just as in the rest of the world, people were demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. They were demonstrating against war in general, particularly in the context of the history of Japan, having been the recipients of 2 nuclear bombs, okay, and also demonstrations which were quite violent, or the clashes were violent, against the building of Narita Airport, which is like Japan's, it's like Tokyo's, you know, equivalent of Heathrow, which at the time was a number of villages which were all going to be destroyed.
Oh, okay.
And so you have photographers going in there and themselves having to wear helmets and themselves being beaten up by police, violent clashes, all of these being depicted photographically. So also a lot of so-called amateur photographers taking pictures as well, and the very outcome of them being untrained, how that was impacting on the nature of the images.
Oh, okay.
You know, but that then became part of the aesthetic.
Yeah.
All right, because what was deemed important was to depict what was going on there, and it didn't matter if stuff was blurred. And by the nature of what was going on, there's movement going on. There's people chucking things. Yeah. There's police beating people up. So you've got that kind of violence and that disorder going on, but it was also in the nature of how people were developing the pictures or taking the pictures, or they might have been running when they're taking the pictures. So there's all kind of mad stuff going on. And that gave rise to an aesthetic and a magazine called Provoke, which was, it's still name-checked to this day, and it's still highly influential in that there's an aesthetic of photography. The only problem for me is that a lot of movements throughout art and throughout music become what I call calcified or ossified into a style or a genre.
Yeah.
All right. That seems to be the nature of culture.
Yeah.
All right. And it becomes a fixed aesthetic as opposed to a principle. Yeah, a principle that you
It's commodification.
Yeah, that's part of it as well. Punk, by its very nature and the nature of the word punk, meaning 18th century prostitute,
Yeah.
And how it's ugly and it's distorted and horrible, and then it slowly became a commodity because some people realize, oh, you can sell this, and then more than that, we realize, no, what you deem as ugly is actually a thing of beauty. All right. So it's that point at which there's an inversion in your perception of something, that what is deemed ugly is actually beautiful. Distortion, a distorted guitar, distorted beats, supposedly ugly lyrics. Actually, this is beautiful poetry. All right. So that's another point of interest. And the same happened for this photography. Skew with horizons, scratched negatives, grain, all right, or today it's digital noise. It's considered undesirable, and then someone says, no, actually that's a beautiful texture. And this high contrast, where you're bleaching out the highlights, or the black is so black, No, you've created a beautiful composition. These forms are beautiful. We don't need the multitude of grey tones and those kind of subtleties. This stuff which is there, it's in your face, and it's visceral and it's physical. It's physical photography. These are things of beauty. But I didn't see that work back then. If I had, I might not have done music.
Oh, okay.
I might have regained a passion for photography at that moment. And, it's now I've gone through this time warp and I'm reliving perhaps a passion I never had in the first place.
Yeah.
And also there's another thing there. It's, at one point in the last 5 years, I was calling it dub photography. Not because, again, I don't think in terms of genres, all right? It's not dub photography meaning, oh, here is a picture of a sound system, or here is a picture of a reggae bass player or a singer. It means principles, application and transference of principles between different art forms, okay? So the principle I'm talking about is the principle of extreme frequencies that we experience sonically in dub, all right? Heavy bass, all right? Or you go to a sound system, hi-hats that are going right up there in the sonic frequency range, almost nothing in the middle, almost disorientating. If you have the tweeters over, I went somewhere where the tweeters were over on one side of the room, and the bass speakers had been put on the other side of the room. That is sonically disorientating. It's crazy, okay? But it's also, you can regard it as a potential photographic aesthetic. Let's have extreme frequencies, dark and white, high contrast. Fuck off all the mids and all the subtleties. Sod that.
I loved my interview with Anirrudha. So in the next episode, he will be talking about his other projects including his solo projects and his photography in more detail, and the political features of his music and dub music in general.